Hey guys, and welcome back to Hoosier Hardware, and today I want to talk about an ITX case that I've been using off and on for the past, well, several years, really since the early days of the channel. I'm actually looking at the Fractal Design Node 202. I want to talk about why it really hasn't aged as well as I had hoped. One of the, in my opinion, one of the major design flaws of this case. And then I want to highlight some of the cases that I'm looking at as a replacement to the Node 202. So as always, links will be in the description down below if you want to check out any of these cases. But with that, let's talk about the Node 202, what it does well, and some of the issues that I have with it. So here on the screen, we have the Node 202. It is a pretty nice, very sort of bare bones aesthetic here. There's not a whole lot of flashiness with the Node 202, which is actually really nice because it's kind of built with that HTPC aesthetic in mind, where it's going to be sitting a lot of the time in some sort of entertainment center, so you don't necessarily want to draw undue attention to it. When we look inside of the case here, there are two primary compartments. For those of you that aren't familiar with this case, it's pretty simple. On the left side of this picture, we have the power supply here with a little vent for airflow to the power supply. And then down at the bottom of the left side is where your motherboard sits. And then there is a PCIe riser card that sort of directs over to your GPU area. Everything works pretty well. The only complaint I really have is that my Node 202 originally came with a 450 watt power supply, and it was a non-modular power supply that was included, and it's pretty difficult to work with all the cabling, especially when you're not necessarily using all of the cabling in such a small compartment area, because by the time the power supply is actually installed, there's not a whole lot of space over here to sort of stuff cables and keep everything sort of tidy. Now, I will say one of the pitfalls of this type of design is that you just don't have much space above the CPU. So any CPU cooler that you're going to use is going to need to be very low profile, even such that the Wraith Spire cooler that came with a lot of Ryzen CPUs, especially the earlier generation CPUs, seem to come with the Wraith Spire cooler. It's a little bit taller than the Wraith Stealth. It would not fit in this case without using a different fan. And I did do a fan mod where I took the Wraith Spire heatsink and then attached a different fan on top of it that was very low profile, and it just barely fits in the case. That's still the cooler that I found to have the best overall performance for this chassis. Now, the upside is there is ventilation directly above the CPU cooler, so the CPU shouldn't have too much trouble getting access to nice cool air. And the side of the case actually has some nice exhaust potential as well, because there is quite a bit of ventilation on the CPU side. And that brings me to my major complaint with the Node 202, and that is that the GPU compartment is very, very choked off. Now, as you can see in this picture, there is some nice ventilation on the bottom of the case. Now, the case with the feet on it doesn't really sit that high off the ground, but as long as it's on a flat surface, you actually can get some airflow moving into the GPU compartment, especially if you have like a dual fan graphics card. It's going to be able to pull in some cool air from there, and you can actually help that out even more by getting rid of this dust filter here. The issue that I've found with this compartment is not the intake. You can actually even fit a pair of 120 millimeter thin, sort of slim profile fans to get even more cool air going towards that GPU. That's not the issue with the GPU compartment. The issue is there's virtually nowhere for that hot air to go once it's been circulated through the GPU. Because for as nice as this CPU side has this nice little mesh here that you can just get rid of some hot air out of the system, the GPU side, the only exhaust you really have access to is this tiny little opening, which, by the way, the opening itself is actually even slimmer than this grill would seem to indicate, because part of it is just blocked off by plastic. So this little opening is where all of your hot air needs to be expelled. And no matter what fan configuration I've used in the little compartment area right below the GPU, because I do have a slim fan that I tried to use as maybe like a little bit of exhaust. It doesn't matter what I do. The RTX 3060 in this system runs up into the 80 degrees Celsius, 85 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Celsius, and with one fan configuration, I even got it up to 90 degrees Celsius with this compartment just being completely choked off. And I think what is primarily happening there is the GPU is able to pull in some cool air. The problem is once the air is in there, it stays in that compartment. There is virtually no exhaust. Now, admittedly, if you stand the case up, and especially if you stand it up in such a way to put the GPU on top, that does help with getting some of that warm air out of the case, because then suddenly this little grill is on top of the chassis, so some natural convection can take some of that warm air out. But even then, you're still running an RTX 3060 completely stock up towards around 80 degrees Celsius, maybe in the high 70s if you're lucky. So regardless of what you do, if you have a reasonably strong gaming graphics card in the Node 202, it's going to run pretty warm. I am looking to replace this case, so let me look at some of the options here, and maybe you can give me some feedback in the comments down below which option you think is right for a mini ITX system that's somewhat portable, but more importantly just gets pretty good airflow and keeps things fairly cool. So I actually looked at all of these based on a recommendation from a Gamers Nexus video. So the first one I want to look at here is the Revolt 3 case, and this one is sort of interesting to me because it looks like it has some pretty good mesh all around. It looks like there's some sort of like micro mesh even behind this sort of larger opened mesh. So I'm not, yeah, you can kind of see it in this picture a little bit better. So I'm not really sure what's going on with the whole double mesh thing here. However, there is a handle on the top that you can have. So this is a very portable system. And from all of the pictures that I can see, it looks like the case should be pretty well ventilated. So from a perspective of just trying to keep components cool, I think this system would actually work really, really well. And for $130, it's not a bad price for a quality mini ITX system. A couple of the other highlights I want to throw out there is, first off, the CPU cooler height is really not limited in a significant way, especially compared to the Node 202. Like, I'm going to be able to use a really beefy CPU cooler in this system and be able to get away with that just fine. I also want to call out that the graphics card length of 335 millimeters should be way more than enough for my mini ITX system. For my ITX systems, I'm typically not throwing in the best of the best graphics cards. My EVGA RTX 3060 is going to fit in there just fine. So I would actually just generally speaking say that I'm leaning towards the Revolt 3, because on top of those better compatibilities for the CPU coolers, the GPU length, also is the fact that the system itself is in a vertical alignment and therefore takes up a very small footprint on a desk. So I'm kind of leaning this direction, but I do have a couple of other options to consider. The more mainstream option is the Cooler Master Masterbox NR200P. It's an ITX system, and what I like about it is, again, small footprint overall. It looks like it has decent ventilation, though that closed off front panel is makes me a little bit nervous. So if I chose this case, I'd want to do some more looking at thermals and that sort of thing. I would definitely avoid using the glass side panel because it might look cool, but functionally that blocks off just an entire other side of the case. So I don't necessarily think that's a great option for this case. I want as much air movement as possible, which I believe this case actually has some bottom ventilation as well, that you can put some fans down there and push air into the case. The feet look a little bit taller than the Node 202, so it can probably get a little bit more access with that bottom ventilation. That being said, it generally speaking looks like a fairly simple case to build in. I wouldn't be using any SSDs that aren't on the motherboard. Again, I'm not using SATA drives whatsoever, so that would save me a little bit of space with using drive cages. And yeah, you can kind of see there at the bottom, it actually might have decent ventilation even with the blocked off front and side panel. So that is definitely in the running, but for the same price as the Revolt 3, I think I'd rather go with the Revolt 3 right now. And that other option is another sort of vertically aligned case, and that's the SSUPD Meshalicious Mini ITX, and this one's actually a little bit cheaper if you just get a PCIe 3.0 riser card. But those are the 3 case options I'm looking at to replace the Node 202, but I do want to hear in those comments down below which case you think I should be going with. With all that said, if you like the video, you know, hey, give it a like, share, subscribe, comment. All those things are very helpful for the channel. You can follow me both on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. And as usual, I'll let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I will see you guys in that next video.